Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 129 of the Sports Daily College Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I've got Mike Koomar with me, and tonight we have got a lot to get to. The penultimate weekend of the regular season in most of the Power 5 leagues. We had a ton of results. We've had a ton of movement around the bubble, around the protected seeds. We've had some narratives starting to form, but Mike, let's go back to something that we used to do here. Start us off with one of your winners of the weekend or the last week. Yeah, they've all of a sudden got a really good resume. Mike, their last two games in the regular season, that Santa Clara game and the Gonzaga game, like you talked about, they were 25-4 going into those, and they were a little bit close to the bubble in the fact they probably needed to win one of them to go to the tournament because they hadn't beaten either of those teams on the road before. They win both of them. All of a sudden, they have 4.2 WAB. They're 27-4, and they will likely only play Santa Clara and Gonzaga again the rest of the way. So I think they made a huge jump in their seed line. I had them all the way up to the 8, and I think there's some arguments to push them up even further to the 7 with those teams losing also, which we'll get to later. But they're like, I think it doesn't matter who wears that uniform, Mike, in that system. Randy Bennett is going to find a way to get them to the tournament. You've got obviously a couple of really good players have gone through there, but they seem to be operating on a little bit of a different level. They go under the radar until they inevitably beat Gonzaga at home every year, like it seems like. And then they go into the tournament, and it's just an extremely different style that doesn't typically bode well against these, high flying transition defensive teams. But they've probably they've yeah. But sometimes they don't though, and they'll lull you to sleep and beat you 65-58, and you were never really in the game. And I think they've done a really decent job over the years. And you can go through the Torvik pages. I've got their Torvik page up here as we're talking about it, Mike. But I think they've done a very good job in the non-conference of providing some winnable opportunities without like totally putting up like a 350 strength of schedule or something. This year, they played five, six top 100 teams in the non-conference. They get out of battle for Atlantis with two victories against 86 Wichita State, 53 Virginia Tech. They lose to Vanderbilt. Turns out Vanderbilt is really good. But they also win on the road at Davidson, a top 100 win. They play Boise State. They lose by one on a neutral, but Boise State's 57th. You get a home win over Northern Iowa, too. So, like, this is how they've had to do this. St. Mary's is going to probably have to schedule a lot of teams around 50th in the net or whatever ranking you want to get to have a chance at a good win without playing a team that's probably going to blow them out. So I think they seem to have gotten it right a couple of years in a row here. They have 10 quad 3 wins. Of course, 5 of those coming in the league, 5 of them coming out of conference. And then you're 8-1 in quad 2, which 4 of those wins are in the non-conference. So they have picked up 9 wins between quads 2 and 3 in the non-conference. That gives you a really solid chance to make the tournament. And then on top of all that, Mike, they get the Santa Clara win, which is their first win against the field, and then they beat Gonzaga, which is their first quad 1A win. So this season has turned out to be really good for St. Mary's. Yeah. Yeah. That's why MTEs are going to be really really beneficial in the future here to these sorts of teams. Like the middle of the pack power conference teams or like the higher end of the Mountain West slash St. Mary's slash, you know, maybe higher end. Yeah. Yeah. And, if you're a UConn or something, you can schedule a game with Illinois and know that that's going to be quad 1A at the end of the year. You know, Teams don't want to do that with St. Mary's because there's no guarantee that it'll stay where you think it is. And it's hard to build a non-conference schedule if there's uncertainty around it. So, obviously, I think Boise State has played St. Mary's a couple years in a row here. You get the solid programs that you could beat, but also if you do get out of there with a victory, is gonna mean something. It's not playing 350 uh, West Georgia and beating them 100-60. Like I think Randy Bennett seems to have gotten a good grasp on what his team can do in the non-conference, and it obviously helps a lot this year that Santa Clara is pretty good too in that league. I believe there was a couple years ago, Mike, where there was San Francisco made it. So, I think obviously Gonzaga and St. Mary's leading the pack there helps the rest of the league potentially get a third bid. But very impressed with Randy Bennett. Obviously, they're going to be going to the West Coast Conference tournament. Their regular season is over. And especially like with them being late at night, Mike, like them playing Santa Clara again is going to be fun. And if they win and get to play Gonzaga again, that'll be pretty fun to watch too. And that would be a team that would say yes in a heartbeat to Miami, Ohio. Like, is Kansas gonna buy a Miami, Ohio game? Gonna pay them, 200 grand to come into their house and to put up a good effort? Probably not. Although Kansas has been a little different. Maybe that's not the best example because they actually do, schedule tough. They've brought in Yale at a couple times and like that. But these are the sorts of teams that have got to play each other. We've seen it a little bit with the Field of 68 Invitational with FAU, Charleston, and Liberty playing each other. That's the sort of way that these teams could address this issue. And Mike, we did St. Mary's as the winner. Let's go with what I think is the biggest loser of the weekend. And they came into the Miami, Ohio conversation sort of out of nowhere, but it's Auburn. They lose a home game to Ole Miss and Chris Beard, 85-79. It was a game that the Rebels led for pretty much the whole game. There was a couple of runs late for Auburn to make it a little bit interesting, but Auburn now drops to 15-14. They take a quad 3 loss. And, Bruce Pearl the next day on CBS gets in a little bit of a tussle with the Miami, Ohio athletic director. Bruce Pearl basically made the argument that Auburn is a better team than Miami. Miami is 29-0 after beating Western Michigan on Friday. Auburn is now 15-14 after the loss to Ole Miss. But let's get your thoughts on this Auburn loss first, and then that whole Miami Ohio conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think they probably have to win the last two to get back in the conversation. I've taken them out of the field. Um, I think it's probably as simple as if they can get to 3 games over 500 because they obviously have the wins. They have 6 wins against the field. But we had this conversation with Joe, Mike. If you played 20 games against tournament teams, is 6-14 really all that impressive? Maybe not. And on the other hand, like what when does winning matter? Ultimately, is the conversation. And Bruce, obviously, look, he of course he's gonna go with his son, a team that he was the coach of 5 months ago. Um, I just don't like. I think we can viewers of that can realize, okay, like he's defending his son. He is not meant to be an unbiased voice in all this. Um, but that conversation has clearly come up. Of course, Miami, that would entail Miami losing a game. If it's to Akron, I think they're going to be going to Dayton, um, especially because, like, how fun would that be for Miami to get in as an at large in Dayton, which is 45 minutes away from Oxford? So I think that conversation is really cool. But at the end of the day, unless Auburn beats Alabama and unless Akron or somebody else beats Miami, we're probably not even going to see that conversation. So, um, yeah. Yeah, I think if they can win these next two, I think they're in. In terms of the actual numbers that you can use to compare the teams, they're in the high 30s roughly, which would put you on the 9 line. I think if they run the table fully, I think their reward for that is an 8-9 game, which, you can say you might want the 10 seed more than the 8 or the 9. But of course, if they become at large into the at large pool, that would mean they would have to lose. So the resume metrics in the high 30s and the WAB, which is 2.9 right now, would obviously they'd probably lose a full point in WAB. That would still put them above all the other teams on the bubble at this point. Um, and probably into the high 30s, maybe even low 40s, but that is still above the benchmark that that I think will be needed to get in. So I think Miami's going to be in if they can beat Toledo and Ohio here. Um, and if they can play Akron, I think it'll be really fun because it is going to break some people's brains when Akron is like 4 point favorites in that game. Be yeah. Yeah, and I think Akron, it would be cool if Akron gets to play in the NCAA tournament too. John Gross is the coach there. They're 24-5. They've lost a couple games to some, decent teams. They lost to Purdue. They lost to Yale, who's the best team in the Ivy League. They lost a neutral Murray State team, who's top 125, and they lost on the road at Troy, a team that has some really. They did beat a power conference team. They had that 3 overtime loss at USC. So, Mike, in another world, I think Akron is probably one of those games away from being at large eligible themselves. They're just minus 0.9 WAB. So they're a really solid team too. I hope we get to see round two between Miami and Akron in the MAC championship. And I think I just really hope we get to see it because I think it would be cool. Yeah. And they I think it is kind of a shame that they don't play a true round robin anymore. They only played at Miami, Ohio. They lost by 3. Like to me, that means that the teams are equal. If you go on the road somewhere and lose by 3, so I think the MAC, if I'm not mistaken, and if it's the same as past years, Mike, I think the MAC championship game is sort of in that mix the day before Selection Sunday, where there's like the semifinal games. So I think it might not get the shine that it deserves, but if it's those two, I'll try and do my best to watch it. But pretty cool. They obviously get over the hump against Western Michigan, and um, Travis Steele had a little bit of a issue with the DJ and his equipment going off the court at halftime. Look, there were some bad calls against Miami in this game, and they had one of their guards ruled out just before the game. Peter Suter fouls out with 7 minutes to go. They were down 8 when their best player fouled out, and they were already without their second best player, and they just found a way. At this point, Mike, we might need to throw out the numbers and say this team deserves a chance to play a quad one game, because if they get in it and it's a close one, they're going to be ready to win it. Like we've seen it a lot with these teams that win a lot of games. They're good in those moments. Yeah. And they didn't this year. They lost, and Portland would be below average in the MAC. And in terms of Miami does have 3 D2 games, so on the team sheet it will say at this point it says 26-0. I don't really think that matters. They don't count towards the WAB or any of the metrics, so I don't know if that's as big of a deal as some people are saying. But there are a number of winners, some losers. I think I'm going to go with a narrative here, Mike, and I want to see if you agree. I think there were a lot of leaders and chasers playing this weekend, and I don't think any of the chasers caught up. I think the leaders in their league, and I think there are 2 games that had the first best team playing against the second best team in the Big Ten and the SEC, and I think the leaders won convincingly in both of them. Friday night in Champaign was Michigan going on the road to play the Fighting Illini. The Wolverines win 84-70. It was a game that they really did control for most of the game. They do lose LJ Case into a torn ACL. That's a little bit of a story, but Michigan here might prove that I think that they're significantly better than the rest of the league. Yeah. Yeah. And I think Illinois is just a less good version of Michigan, right? They have a lot of length and they have a lot of length. I think Illinois, like, you can't win with the forwards against Michigan. You just can't. I think you need two guards who are capable of going for 20 each and getting them both to be good on the same day. Now, you can argue that Duke didn't have that, but they also have the best second best front court in the country with Pat and Gongba and Cam Boozer. And in terms of the guards for Illinois, I think that's where they were a little bit lacking here. Mike, obviously Wagler gets his, but I think there's been a little bit of a downturn with Stojakovic, and there's so many, there's so many, like, so much is put on Boswell in that situation. Um, so, I think they could. And this is the LJ Kaysen, a guard off the bench for Michigan, is out for the season. Really unfortunate for him because I thought he was really starting to play really well. He was sort of the secondary ball handler. It is now, not that it wasn't already, but it is now squarely on the shoulders of Elliot Cadeau for Michigan. We have seen a much better version of him this year, but I think just in the back of my mind, I have some of those North Carolina performances that come to mind. And they have nowhere else to turn now. I actually thought Kaysen was the better guard against Duke when they played, a week and a half ago. But yeah, I think it is squarely on Cadeau's shoulders now for Michigan, and that might be just a little bit scary. In terms of their in terms of their rivals, Mike, you mentioned them earlier. Michigan State could have easily been the biggest winner of the week in terms of moving up seed lines. They pick up two huge road victories on the road against Purdue and on the road against Indiana. I have them jumping all the way up to my last two seed right now. Um, they have their numbers were lacking against those 2 and 3 seeds. They have now gotten to those numbers in most situations, and then maybe even over. Their fifth in WAB. And just to show how impressive these two wins were, they got 1.6 WAB from 2 games, which is obviously very difficult. Less of an important number when you're not on the bubble, but it shows how much ahead of the bubble you are. Their 7.4 WAB is much higher than the rest of the two seeds. But yeah, they seem to be rounding into form, which I guess we should expect as the calendar turns to March. Yeah. Yeah. They, I think there is a specific, I, I don't want to say scheme, but there's a specific skill that you have to beat Michigan State. And Purdue and Indiana don't have them. First of all, if they make shots, I think you've got to protect the paint against them and hope they miss. And I thought Indiana actually did a pretty good job in the paint, but they were 12 of 24 from three. They were sort of, I don't want to say playing with their food, but every time they needed to score, they did. Indiana would pull it down to five, and then Kurt Tang would hit a three at the end of the shot clock, and he'd be like, all right, back to eight. It was rather annoying as a fan of the other team. Um, Indiana's best run in that entire game, Mike, was 5-0, which is obviously shows how consistent Michigan State is. The profile that you need to beat them is you need to be able to to withstand their physicality and not wear down, and you have to have some one-on-one offense because their scheme is good enough where the first, second, and sometimes even third options are not there. I think the obviously it's my team, but the difference in last year's team versus this year's team is evident in how they played Michigan State. Indiana against Mike Woodson had a lot of success against Tom Izzo at Michigan State because they had physicality and because they could win one-on-one. This year's team doesn't do that for Indiana, and I think you could have played them 10 times. I think you maybe win one of them. Like this this was not a toss-up game. This was probably an 8 or 9 out of 10 time winner for Michigan State, and I think the same could be said for Purdue to a little bit of a lesser extent. They don't have the best physicality, especially when Clough and Jacobson are ineffective. And then on top of that, you add the fact that Michigan State hit a few shots in that game, 23 of 36 from two. They were only 6 of 19 from three in that game, but they started to wear down the other team. And if you don't have one-on-one, like you're not going to score at them at a great clip. So I think this strategy is really starting to work as legs get tired towards the end of the year. After you've got tons of film out there, you're not going to surprise anybody. That is why I think Michigan State tends to turn it up this time of the year. Yeah. 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 I mean, I think like Indiana battled. They didn't lose the rebounding battle by a ton. I think it was eight. Like, and it wasn't particularly close. Michigan State did go 5 minutes without scoring at the end of the game, which made their numbers look a little worse. But they were shooting over 60% from the field and from three for most of this game. So obviously, if that happens, I think Final Four is a possibility for the Spartans. And at this point, Mike, I think it is going to take a really, really big mess up for them to lose before the Sweet 16. All right, Mike. Well, I mentioned two chasers not coming close against the leaders. The first one was obviously Michigan in the Big Ten. Let's go to what I think at the time was 1 versus 2 in the SEC. Florida hosts Arkansas. I did a stream for this game. The Razorbacks were leading 16-11, and then it went completely the other way. Florida wins 111-77. This Arkansas doesn't play defense. We've known that for a little bit, but Florida now is really starting to click offensively, and I think the same phrase can be applied to Florida if you just subtract the word Michigan and add Florida. Florida is a class above the rest of the SEC. Yeah, it's a. I think it's a bigger gap than in the Big Ten with Michigan. That was funny. That was funny. Yeah, I thought this game like obviously might be the extreme of both teams, but like there was some not good stuff here from Arkansas. I thought there were a few dirty plays once the outcome of the game was final. I think there were a couple plays in this game where Mick Cronin, if he were the coach, would have thrown out his player. Like what happened here is what Mick Cronin thought happened when he against was it Michigan State? I think it was Michigan State. Yeah, um, but I think Arkansas isn't deep. They don't have a ton of depth. They got into bad foul trouble, which Florida I think automatically does to every team. But um, I was totally impressed here with this dominating performance from the Gators. Like you said, their guards are starting to play better. This was the Boogie Fland revenge game. There were some things going back and forth there. There was some stuff going back and forth with him, which I don't think are necessarily true. But Arkansas is just going to be one of those teams I think where when they run into a good team, they're going to lose probably by a lot, and they might look really good in the first round when they play, an 11 seed from a power conference that, TCU or something. They're probably going to beat them. But I think after that first game, I think it's danger zone for unless Acuff can go crazy. In terms of the last one seed, Mike, I think it is probably Florida's if they win out. I don't think it's theirs now, but I think Mike, the Florida if Florida wants to, they're going to win the SEC tournament. And I mean that if they go there and UConn hasn't lost by then, they might just say, "All right, like we're not going to get anybody a ton of minutes. We're going to get some other people time and we're just going to get ready for the tournament." Because I do think if they run the table, they pick up like two more good wins, they might have a little bit of a argument over UConn. But UConn beat them head to head. So, I think if UConn runs the table, I think they get it. Because you have the neutral court head to head, which I think is the best way to determine who's better. I think a home head to head is sort of, just because you lost to somebody on the road doesn't mean you're worse than them. Um, Neutral head to head, obviously, we've separated Duke and Michigan with that. I think it's very easy to say that we could separate UConn and Florida with that. Um, in terms of a road head to head, which I think should have a little bit more weight, a road head to head was erased in the SEC. Alabama goes on the road to Tennessee, beats them 71-69. Tennessee won in Tuscaloosa earlier, so you see the rare road split. Um, is this sort of two teams going in opposite directions? I know Nate Ament got hurt and he wasn't the same when he came back in, and Tennessee did sort of give this one away. But it's been a revolving door at that number 2 spot in the SEC, Mike. Does Alabama have it now? A few. Like that game, Mike, just was very familiar for Rick Barnes. Like they have had losses like that in tournaments, in regular seasons. That you just cannot do that. They had that game won. If you're up by double digits with less than 10 minutes left, you really should win. And they didn't. And I think Alabama was able to sort of get away with a little bit of a not great offensive performance. They only hit 10 triples. Um, they don't get to the free throw line a bunch. They give Tennessee rebounded more than half of their misses. So I think Alabama was this was not the best that we could see from the Crimson Tide, and they still got across the line. They have got Georgia on the road and Auburn at home to finish up, and it would just can you just please beat Auburn at home? We don't need them in the tournament. Like I'm asking Alabama to beat them. Um, like we do not need to see Auburn play Santa Clara in Dayton because they're probably going to beat them, honestly. But they don't deserve to be there. So hopefully Alabama can beat Auburn. I think, Mike, let's go Big East, and then we can preview a few of the upcoming games. We had those two tight UConn games, or one tight UConn game, two UConn wins on Wednesday. We may have talked about this already. I did a stream for it. I'm thinking we recorded after, or maybe we recorded before. But UConn wins 72-40 against St. John's. The Red Storm missed 25 straight shots. One of the worst performances in Rick Pitino's entire career. UConn follows that up with a really close victory against Seton Hall, where they get helped across the line by a couple of some home cooking with the whistles. St. John's also bounces back though with an 89-57 victory against Villanova, the third and final team from the Big East that's going to be in the tournament. Zuby Ejiofor is a triple-double. So I think at this point, Mike, we know what the Big East is unless there's some magic at MSG, which I'm not putting past it. But we've got a top team, we've got a second team, we've got a big gap to the third team, and then we have a big gap to the rest. Yeah, they're in the top 75 now. Yeah. Yep. They've taken UConn to the last play 2 times this year. So has Providence, to be fair. I think there's a real chance that this Big East tournament gets fun. Because honestly, Mike, if we get a bunch of blowouts and then St. John's UConn round 3, like that, like no, we don't need to see that. If Providence win their last 2 games, they're going to go up to 5th in the league. I could see them beating Seton Hall and UConn, and they've already beaten St. John's in that building. Man, I think there is a possibility for Providence or Xavier to go far. I don't know if the other teams quite have the offense, but it would be really cool to see like a true potential bid stealing situation here at the Big East. But Well, it's a true home and home, so they must have to coming up. Oh no, they did. It was early in the year. They played them twice early in the first 5 games. But yeah, they a tougher start, which made their middle and later a little easier, which is why they're up there. But they've got 8 wins in the Big East, Mike. DePaul. They've won 3 in a row in the conference. I don't. I think. I do not think it's in my lifetime, but yeah, yeah. So like they're in the mix too. They've got a couple of decent players. Like I think there is a possibility that one of the big dogs, one of the top two, goes down in their first game, and then all bets are off. Because until then, Mike, the story has sort of been written here on the Big East, but maybe somebody can throw a wrench into things, which would make it very interesting. Obviously, there's 3 teams over 500 in a 11-team league. Seton Hall is 500, and then you've got everyone else underneath that. Everybody has 5 wins. Like there is a chance. It would be fun for Providence to go on a run, but at the same time, it's probably not good for them to like potentially save Kim English's job. Um, Might be a Kevin Keats situation, but they've been fun recently. They've been down a bunch of players and they're still playing well, so I think the Big East tournament could be pretty cool. We are probably if we get to something next weekend, Mike, or even early next week, it'll be time to preview these tournaments. So potentially there's something there. But let's wrap it up with a preview of some of the games ahead. Obviously, we're doing this sort of early Monday night, so you see the current Duke North Carolina State score and Iowa State Arizona's later. Those will be over. I'm going to put this out right away, but this will be over by the time most people listen to it. So, what games are you looking forward to here this week, Mike, as we get closer to the conference tournaments? And in terms of Texas Tech, Mike, we sort of jumped over that. They did win at the Hilton Coliseum at Iowa State without JT Toppin, as we know. And Christian Anderson was in some serious foul trouble there. He got his fourth with like 12 minutes to go. They went like 6 minutes without him, kept their lead. They were up big early and really sort of held it in the double digits range for the whole time. It To me, Mike, with Texas Tech, I think Grant McCasland could take any group of players that are like sort of high major quality to the tournament. Like, obviously, if he gets his stars, I think they'll have a chance to win a national championship. But I think you could put him at any power conference job, and I think he'd get him to the tournament. That's how good of a coach I think he is. And he might be the most important player in the country to a team. And I've done a little bit of a pre, seed line here. I'm not gonna have time to do a full projection probably until Wednesday or Thursday maybe, but I did the top four seeds today. The post will be out by the time this is released, but I think Texas Tech is ninth right now. They do have some top of the line wins, but everyone does up there, and the wins start to fall off just a little bit, and once you get into like the third, fourth, and fifth best win, so that's why I think Texas Tech's ceiling might not be all the way up at a two seed. Um, but they're still in a great spot, and I think they have individually grown a lot this year. They had, we talked about it when they got thrashed by Purdue in the Bahamas, Mike, that it was Christian Anderson and JT Toppin and no one else. At times that's been the case this year, but they really have improved out. Like Lawan Watts is a solid player right now. You get Atwell given some really solid games too. So they're all stepping up in their roles for now. And then in terms of TCU, Mike, they have sort of benefited big time here from doing nothing, beating Q2, Q3 games. They got their big win against a tournament quality team. They are away from the bubble for now. Obviously, this win would seal it. I think if they lose, they're still probably in the field, but it feels like they have been waiting for a total statement, and this would certainly be that. But they're in a good spot here. They've been able to beat the teams that they were supposed to and get away. I have them as my fifth to last team in right now. And honestly, a little bit of a gap between them and fourth. I think they might even stay in fifth if they do fall. But should be a good one there in the Big 12. Fox Sports 1, 7 p.m. Eastern Time in Lubbock. The other big game Tuesday night is Nebraska at UCLA, Mike. The Nebraska still hasn't clinched that triple bye yet in the Big Ten tournament, and then UCLA at 19-10. Again, probably one or two spots ahead of TCU in terms of the bracket. Like, certainly not a lock yet, but they're probably one tournament win away from being locked. So we've seen a little bit of a resurgence here for UCLA, but then they go out to Minnesota and lose to a 500 Golden Gophers team. So obviously we know what Nebraska is, but what do you think's going into this one? Yep. And in terms of UCLA, Mike, they just have one win outside the Pacific time zone. That's at Penn State. They're 0-3 on a neutral. They do just have one home loss this year, which is why they're 19-10. But in terms of, you know, stamping their spot in the tournament, they don't have any wins away from Pauley Pavilion to make that like a real case. So in that end, you need a third big win here at home. If you lose this, and then you're going to play a USC team who's going to need to win that game. There's a way you drop those, and other bubble teams do things, and you find yourself in Dayton. So, UCLA definitely not a lock yet. They're probably going to have to win this one or a game in Chicago for the Big Ten tournament to really feel happy with where they're at. And then in terms of Nebraska, I mean, you said it pretty well. Nobody's won both of these games yet, because it's far away. You've been out there for a week. You're probably looking forward to getting out of there, even though LA is probably one of the best places to be in the country this time of year when it's so cold everywhere else. But yeah, I think Nebraska is on the verge of sort of stamping a protected seed. I think they're there. I think, they play Iowa at home in a semi rivalry game to end the year. Like, they're 2 wins away from really putting together a great season. And they're going to play two teams who are sort of in that, 1 win away from being a lock. So I think this one's 11 o'clock FS1. Not sure I'm going to make it all the way through this one, but should be a pretty good Tuesday. In terms of Wednesday, there's a big game in the ACC, Mike. We've got Miami on the road at SMU. The Mustangs are in a very similar position to UCLA and TCU, I think. They're in a good position, but one more win would really seal it. But obviously, what do you see going down here at the Moody Coliseum? and and the Knolls have been playing better recently too. They've beaten a couple of the teams around them, so I do think that this one's important. If you lose it, I think then you can start to worry a little bit. You might see yourself in some last four buys projections. You might see yourself on the 10 line, and then you don't want to lose both these, then take a quad three loss, and then three bid stealers happen, and then bang, you're out. Like, it could all happen really quickly. So I think they're probably one of these 2 wins away from being locked in the field, but you do never know with SMU because they don't have a quad 1A win. They have two losses outside of quad 1. Like, if it comes to it, there are some holes in this resume that could ultimately leave them out if they're not able to pick up another victory. But very, very interesting game here, Mike. Miami's in a really good spot. They definitely don't have to win this, but they're thinking, like, let's get another win over a tournament quality team, and let's make a push up the seed list here. All these 7 and 8 seeds are losing. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Miami could get up to that 7 line. I think they're probably a 9, maybe end of the 8 now. But sneaky, really good game there in the SEC. In terms of elsewhere, we're getting into the weekend slate here, so I think we'll leave it at that. But unless you got anything else to add, Mike, we're going to wrap it up for today. Yeah, I think they have fallen into the mess of the SEC teams at the 5 seed, which I've mentioned: Tennessee, Arkansas, Bama's on the 4. But yeah, like I think they've won enough here to sort of, like, they beat Kentucky, they beat Texas A&M, they beat Georgia. Like, they've beaten some tournament quality teams in here. But once upon a time, Mike, they were 16-0, and now they're 22-7. That's 6-7 in the last 13 games. And obviously, it's been a very difficult schedule. But if you're talking about trading games with tournament quality opposition, it sounds like a round of 32 loss to me. And then 2 road games to go here, Mike. Ole Miss is playing better too. That they're favored by 7 points there. Like, of course they should win it, but that's no show up and win the game type. And then, a rivalry game over Tennessee, who they lost to on their home floor, so they're going to want revenge there. But Vanderbilt's still in a pretty good spot. Obviously, a great year for them, but if it is starting to slip a little bit here for their sake. I hope they can lock in and finish off a good season. So, I think we're going to wrap it up there, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.